What are the supplements people need to stop wasting money on, Spencer? And what are the ones that actually are worth taking?
Well, relative to the microbiome, the first thing you don't want to take is non-organic psyllium because there's a loophole with the FDA, and that stuff is loaded with pesticides in ways that even regular food can't allow. So I wouldn't do that. The second thing is a lot of people are spending money on a lot of probiotics, and they don't understand that if you don't make some space in the gut where you knock out the bad bacteria for the good bacteria to grow, well, if there's no real estate, they're just going to pass on through. So it's not that you don't do probiotics, but you have to do it in the right order. You have to first clear the gut out of the bad bacteria so there's some real estate, so there's some surface area for the good bacteria to grow.
Let's unpack both real quick. So the first thing you said is non-organic psyllium loaded with pesticides. What are some supplements that typically have that in it?
Well, it's just like if you're going to do a fiber supplement and you went out and bought some psyllium,
Psyllium
just
husk.
make sure, yeah, make sure it's organic. Yerba mate, I believe, has an organic one. There's also very high lead levels in some psylliums. My favorite way to do fiber is just to soak some azuki beans and then drain them off and slow cook them the next day.
Oh, good tip. That breaks down a lot of those anti-nutrients as well.
Yeah.
All right, so make sure your psyllium husk is organic, and then the probiotics. You want to first make some real estate, as you mentioned, for those probiotics to do their job. What about the fact that people take the same probiotic strains over and over and over? Is there a potential problem with monoculturing in the gut with taking the same strains?
No, I don't think so because the gut's going to regulate itself if it's healthy. The issue is they're taking the wrong kinds. So, for instance, there's a lot of bacterial strains that will make both D and L lactic acid. And the D lactic acid is a metabolic toxin. We have a limited capacity to break it down, and it causes all sorts of neurologic stuff. So you don't want to be getting the probiotics that are making the D lactic acid. Another issue is a lot of probiotics make histamine. And, plenty of people are histamine toxic, either from histamine in their body or because they've got toxic amines in their gut. And so, the probiotics I take are delactate producing histamine free probiotics. And what I do is I put them in carrot juice and I stick them in an incubator for 3 days. And then I make my own fermented carrot juice that way.
Of course you do, taking it to the next level. What are your thoughts on synthetic multivitamins that contain like folic acid and different synthetic ingredients?
The fact that it's synthetic does not necessarily mean it's bad as long as it's identical. The problem with synthetics is sometimes, it's scientific arrogance. Sometimes it's a chiral version of it, right? So, for instance, L-lactic acid is one rotation and D-lactic acid is another. It's chiral. It's not symmetric when you flip it. And so, if they're giving you something saying, oh, this is the ingredient, but they don't bother to tell you that it's actually the mirror image or 50% one and 50% the other mirror image correct, then that can cause problems. Another issue is that when you're taking things like folic acid, well, we now know that folic acid's a toxin, right? It's you want them methylated, and so it's always better to go through food if you can, the way God and nature intended you. That having said that, I take 500 milligrams of vitamin C like almost every hour when I'm doing a cardiovascular detox that I'm doing right now, and that's synthetic. But it was a synthetic vitamin C that was properly made and, hopefully not from GMO corn and that kind of thing.
Ascorbic acid is what you're referring to?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What about vitamin D? Just taking the vitamin D without E, A, and K, the other fat soluble vitamins. Can that be problematic long term?
Well, I would never pose myself as an expert in the vitamins and those interactions. That's a whole special world. But what I would say is that just because they're vitamins and you get them from a health food store does not mean that they can't have very powerful effects. And if you take them in high amounts, like some people are taking really high doses of melatonin, well, that there's a dark side to that. There's a dark side to methylene blue. There's a dark side to a lot of these things. So, just because you found it in a health food store does not mean that it will not have some very powerful effects. And you should understand it has to be done, as you said, in combination with other things that are cofactors for it.
What's the dark side of taking high dose melatonin? There's no negative feedback loop with it that I haven't discovered
Oh, you'll
unless you
definitely
have.
find people getting headaches from that, and you're going to downregulate your natural melatonin production.
I haven't, so that's what I haven't found though. I haven't found any research on humans that show there's a negative feedback loop with melatonin.
The only thing I've ever found that doesn't have a negative feedback loop is oxytocin. But again, I'm certainly not an expert in this.
Okay.
It's just my general understanding of how receptors and feedback systems in the body work is, so the body has to have a natural way of knowing how much melatonin to make for itself, right? And so it's making melatonin. Then when it hits a certain point, it says, okay, that's enough melatonin. I need to stop production and shrink the receptors down. So if you take lots and lots of melatonin, I mean, that's sort of like taking steroids and thinking your testicles aren't going to shrink. It's, be careful.
Yeah, I'm with you with everything in using cyclically, but what I've researched with melatonin, I've done a lot of research on it. I haven't seen anything in literature that shows it's the same thing as taking testosterone in terms of your body shutting it down. With that being said, 100% cyclical use, methylene blue, all that stuff. I recommend I use that on a cyclical basis. Okay, so we
Right,
unpacked.
but just let me add one last thing to that.
Okay.
Just because we don't find it in the literature doesn't mean it's not there. It just means it may be that it's not there, or it may be we've hit the limits of where our research is at the moment, and no one has bothered to look for it, right? And there has to be a distinction made there.
That's a fair point. Okay, let's transition now to longevity, at least as it pertains to like foods, nutrition, diet for longevity. What are your favorite foods to extend our lifespan and health span, Spencer?
Okay, so you're as old as your microbiome, right? So when they take the blood of young people and put it in the blood of old people, as some of the psychopaths in positions of money and leadership like to do, they'll get younger, right? That's kind of vampirism. But where does the blood come from? Well, an enormous number of the compounds in your blood are coming from your microbiome. And if you take the stool of the microbiome of a young animal and put it in an old animal, the old animal gets younger and vice versa. The other thing that happens if you transplant the microbiome from one animal to the other is you'll see the personalities of the donor show up in the recipient, right? Because your short-chain fatty acids from your microbiome have an enormous effect on your brain.
That's crazy, by the way. That's so really cool.
Yeah, right. So if you have a bad microbiome, then what you find is it creates inflammatory lipids, toxic amines, toxic short-chain fatty acids, and poisonous gases. And those, especially the poisonous gases, they will accelerate senescence, right? So they are inducing aging in the cells. And so I don't think it's so much of what do we need to do to regenerate ourselves as so much what do we need to do to keep from aging in the first place. And if your microbiome is toxic, which happens with age for most people, if they don't know how to manage it, then they're going to be generating all these things that are accelerating cellular senescence. So I would focus on the microbiome if you want to age gracefully.
Okay, we'll talk about your favorite ways to improve the microbiome. You have some really fascinating research on that and some other stuff. Stay tuned, by the way, for those watching and listening. There's some mind-blowing info coming your way very soon. How do you test the gut microbiome? Are you looking at a stool test and looking at diversity and different ratios of bacteria? Like, what is your favorite way to look at the health of the gut microbiome?
Well, I love the $500 complete stool tests, but even some of those won't give the most important value, which is your pH. And you can do that at home with some pH paper. Here's one. Right, there's some 6 to 8 pH paper. And all you have to do is take a little bit of that and press it against some fresh stool. If the stool's really dry, you're going to have to take a sample from the middle. And when the pH paper gets damp, and you'll see, the change in the paper, you look at the color it turns, and that tells you the pH. And the pH is the main driver, the main indicator of how your gut's doing. In 1926, before antibiotics, the pH of healthy infant stool that was being breastfed was 4.88, which is incredibly acidic, right? And if you go over to Africa now, you'll see pHs in some of the rural communities up to 5.7. But if you look at the pH of people, walking down the street, like when I ask the people who do the stool tests, the labs that I work with, I said, what's your average pH value? They're like 7.2, 7.3. That's alkaline, and that's a total mess. And what happens is when we have to know the distinction between a norm and an optimal value. So if the norm for pH is 7.3, but healthy is 6.3, which is 10 times more acidic, and then the doctor says, well, you're within the norm values. Yeah, but if the norm values are creating all sorts of disease and aging and cancer and Lord knows what else, that's not what you're looking for.
Yeah. Okay, so 6.3 is the healthy value is what I heard.
What I
Or
like to see stool pH at is somewhere between 6 and 6.3. I'd like to see it even more acidic, but realistically, with an American, what you can do with a regular diet and the way 6.0 to 6.3 is achievable.
so that pH, does it correlate? Does a lower, let's say a healthier pH, 6 to 6.3 or less, correlate to more diversity in the gut, or not necessarily so?
The answer to that question will take me about 30 minutes to get to, and it's a great question. But if you don't mind, can I answer it with some things before that so that it's all in context?
Do it. Yeah, do your thing.
All right. So initially, when people were looking at working on the microbiome, the focus was originally on probiotics, right? As your earlier question was, what probiotic do you need? Because good bacteria, they're damaged by antibiotics and glyphosate and chlorinated water. But it turns out that they're not typically wiped out. They're decreased in number and they're dormant, but they're still there. So if you do a stool test, you'll see that the good bacteria in someone who's taken a lot of antibiotics might be really, really suppressed, but not zero, right? So adding more probiotics doesn't necessarily help. You've probably already got them in there, unless you've been on Cipro and for, ages, okay? So then the next question does, okay, if we don't need more bacteria per se, if we just need to wake them up and grow them, let's do prebiotics, right? So, I've got that Panaceum product I make when I was studying primitive hunter-gatherer cultures, and I said, okay, they're doing 9 different prebiotics, not the 1 or 2 you find in the stuff in the stores, and let me do that, and then I'll regrow the good bacteria. And it was good for a lot of people. One of the things, one inexpensive test you can do to see if you're getting enough prebiotics is, do you need toilet paper? Because no healthy animal soils itself. And what I found is when I started taking a good ratio of prebiotics, I didn't need toilet paper anymore.
So in other words, the more you wipe your butt, the unhealthier your gut.
Yeah, that's one inexpensive test. And when I consult with people, one of the questions I ask is, how many times do you wipe? And a lot of times they're kind of hesitant to answer, because sick people are ones who are calling me and their guts are usually out.
Yeah.
And so I'll help them out and I'll say the right answer is 0. And they, there's this pause, like, really? I'm like, yeah, we'll get you there. Okay, so prebiotics really important, but that wasn't enough either, because even if you feed the good bacteria in the gut, if there's no real estate for them to take over, where do they grow? What happens is the bad bacteria take over some real estate and they don't want to leave. They don't give the good bacteria a place to grow. So then what you have to do before you take the probiotics and before you take the prebiotics is you got to knock out the bad bacteria. And this is the first rabbit hole I started going down in this particular, deep dive I was doing. Roughly speaking, bacteria can be divided into 2 classes. There's gram-positive and gram-negative. And what it's referring to is the membrane on the bacteria. The gram-negative bacteria has a membrane that's really sophisticated and protects it from almost everything. That's why, it's very difficult to kill gram-negative bacteria with antibiotics and natural antimicrobials. You can do it, but you're going to kill far more gram-positive that you want than you are gram-negative that you don't. And you're also, running the risk of just making the gram-negative go dormant, so that when you knock them both down and then they both grow back, the gram-negative has a head start. So then I was looking for something that would kill gram-negative, but not gram-positive. Ozone is one thing that does that, but how are you going to get that through your whole digestive tract? Ellagic acid is something that is helpful for that. It's based on the fact that we've been having ellagitannins in our diet for so long that our gram-positive bacteria have kind of acclimated to it. We have that, our Ellagica product. But it's what do we need to do to really knock out gram-negative bacteria? And I was praying, I'm like, God, I know you've got some way to do it. I know the body's probably doing it somehow. What is it? And so I was, it was late at night. I was going through the medical journals over and over. When you read medical journals, there's lots and lots of very technical stuff about how they do the study and all this. And it's you can get blurry-eyed and you can miss a sentence, but something just said, no, go back and read that one sentence, right? And it said, it was the key to how to knock down gram-negative bacteria. And basically what it is bacteria make short-chain fatty acids. Now, the good bacteria make good short-chain fatty acids, specifically lactic acid, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. And the bad bacteria, they make bad short-chain fatty acids. And what happens is it is the good short-chain fatty acids from the good bacteria that knock out the bad bacteria. So what happens is those short-chain fatty acids, they are one of the few things that can make it through the membrane of the gram-negative bacteria. And they're not really acidic, because if they were, they would set off defense mechanisms in the bad bacteria. So they get in there and they're mildly acidic, but they keep building up, and like a frog in a pot, eventually the gram-negative bacteria can't handle it, and then they give up the ghost. Whereas the gram-positive bacteria, they have no problem neutralizing those short-chain fatty acids. So the trick to knocking out the gram-negative bacteria in the body is good short-chain fatty acids. However, most of us don't make enough. We don't make enough because we don't have enough gram-positive bacteria to make them. So, if you just go through the body from the mouth down, gram-negative bacteria is what's causing tooth and gum decay. Gram-negative bacteria is what's causing stomach ulcers. Gram-negative bacteria is what's messing up the small and the large intestine. It's the E. coli in the prostate, and it's what gets into the bladder. It's what gets into the arteries. It's what gets into the joints. It's all gram-negative bacteria that's getting in there. So being able to get the gram-negative bacteria, not just in your gut, but in your whole body, knocked down a few pegs is really good.
Interesting. So the best way to do that is with good short chain fatty acids.
Yes, and I'll give you the action step on how to get there in a sec.
Okay.
The rabbit hole keeps going. Okay. So what happens is, in a lot of people, gram-negative bacteria starts to take over the microbiome. Right? It gets in there and just slowly, bit by bit, takes more and more territory until by the time people in their 80s, they're just completely overloaded with gram-negative bacteria. Now, what gram-negative bacteria do is, instead of making the good short-chain fatty acids the body needs, they make inflammatory lipids, toxic short-chain fatty acids, putrefying amines, and poisonous gases. It's a nasty brew of stuff that gets made in there by those guys. So let's look at these toxin classes one by one. First, we have the inflammatory lipids. So the gram-negative membrane, the part that makes it so impervious to everything, is called a lipopolysaccharide. And lipopolysaccharides are not something you want in your body. They are the most inflammatory substance known to man, and they cause the membranes in the body to leak. Now, I know your audience has heard about leaky gut, but that's not the only organ that can leak. Lipopolysaccharides can cause the blood-brain barrier to leak, the blood-spinal cord barrier to leak, the pericardium, which protects the heart, can leak, the peritoneum, which protects the liver, the capillaries, which feed all, are the microcirculation of the body, can leak. And in women, the mesoovarium, which is what protects the ovaries and the eggs, can leak. Those organs leaking, it's certainly not good, but then also if it causes the blood vessels to leak, that's a hemorrhage, which is a medical emergency, right? So to avoid this, what happens is the body seals these leaks with lipoprotein A, which is sticky bad LDL cholesterol. So if you have high LDLs, rather than trying to suppress LDLs, ask yourself, why are your arteries leaking? And why? Because that's why the LDL is there, to plug up the leaks. It's probably from gram-negative bacteria.
So when lipopolysaccharides, it's an issue. And I want to know, what are the top causes of that? I'm sure it's different for everybody, but when you have a high total LDL, it would be more accurate if you said like the particle sizes of the let's say pattern B were high versus the other pattern, because there could be the large buoyant ones that are not problematic unless you think they are, and then the ones that are actually problematic, which is the pattern B small sticky.
Yeah, I'm talking about lipoprotein A.
Got it.
Where the LPS, and if I didn't say it, I apologize.
No,
So,
you did. I just wanted to make that clear, just in case somebody didn't know. Yeah.
right. So if you have an overgrowth of gram-negative bacteria, when the bacteria dies, because it's always dying and renewing, the membrane is released, and those little bits of LPS cause leaks in the gut, and then the LPS gets in the bloodstream, and then it causes leaks everywhere. So what else does lipopolysaccharides? LPS is lipopolysaccharides. So lipopolysaccharides damage mitochondria, raise blood pressure, and cause premature cellular senescence. Back to your question, how do you anti-age? Well, the first thing is don't make lipopolysaccharides.
Tell us how to not make it. What's the
Yes.
problem? What's the root cause here?
Well, we have to knock down the gram-negative bacteria because that's where lipopolysaccharides are found in that cell wall.
And to knock
Okay,
down the negative gram bacteria, we need to get good, healthy, short chain fatty acids.
I'll get you there. I promise.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
keep, I'm just reminding the
Yeah,
audience,
yeah,
like we're
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
get
yeah,
there. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We'll get there. Okay, so the next set of toxins created by the bad bacteria are the toxic short chain fatty acids. So remember, we have four good short chain fatty acids: lactic, acetic, propionic, and butyric, and they do a lot of really important things for us. So imagine there's a factory with 30 trillion machines in it, and each machine has 150 different kinds of dials that are found on it that control the machine. So it's the short chain fatty acids that control a lot of these dials. So in this analogy, the 30 trillion machines are the 30 trillion cells of the body, and the dials are receptors, right? So when you have good short chain fatty acids in your body, your machines are being continuously fine-tuned and adjusted to keep you healthy in all the different situations you find yourself in. On the other hand, if you have the bad gram-negative bacteria making bad short-chain fatty acids like formic acid, valeric acid, isovaleric acid. Formic acid, by the way, is the poison that makes ant bites sting.
Oh.
Then these things they also attach to all these little dials, all these receptors, but they play havoc. They turn them all in the wrong directions and create all sorts of issues, right? And how do we experience that? Inflammation, imbalanced immune system, diabetes, brain fog, Parkinson's, heart, liver, brain damage, and so on. Okay, so there's another one. Okay, here's another set of toxins we get when the gut goes negative, and that's the putrefying amines. Now, one such amine I'm sure you've heard of, it's TMAO, which is talked about a lot in the carnivore diet world. Now, we know that TMAO will increase foam cells, which is what arterial plaque is made up of. So aside from being responsible for the smell of decaying fish, TMAO also raises the colon pH 1,000-fold, which we'll talk about later is a huge problem. Other toxic amines include putrescine and cadaverine. And you could tell by the names putra and cadaver that these things don't smell good. These are what are responsible for the bad smell of corpses. And here's an interesting side. They increase threat behavior in people. So that means if you have cadaverine and putrescine being generated and it's coming out in your breath, other people, without knowing why, if they breathe it, can get angry at or afraid of you. That's a reaction to that the smell of the corpse smells. And then the last toxic amine we discuss would be 4-EP, which demyelinates the nerves and the brain, and you find associated with autism and other neurologic stuff. Now, all these toxic amines come from protein and a bad microbiome. It's not that eating meat is bad. I eat meat at every meal. The problem is when there aren't enough prebiotics in the diet. This forces the bacteria in the gut to ferment meat and not prebiotics. Now, you can get prebiotics from meat. If you eat connective tissue, that's meat probiotic. I'm sorry, meat prebiotic, right? But a lot of people, they're just eating muscle and they're not getting the connective tissue. And so they're getting all the protein, but none of the prebiotics. And then the bacteria in their gut, especially if the gut's filled with gram-negative Enterobacter and gram-positive Clostridia, will start making these toxic amines. One another issue of the amines is they're detoxified by the same system that clears out histamine. So if you have a lot of toxic amines in your body, then they can act like histamine and you can end up with allergic reactions. And allergic reactions are not just like an itchy eye or a runny nose or an upset stomach. That's like TH1 and that's histamine 1 and 2 receptors, the common ones. But there's histamine 3 and 4 receptors, which you find in your immune system and in your nervous system and other places. And so you can have neurologic stuff go on or immune stuff go on or inflammation all over the body that is actually an allergy. And people don't realize it. And so that can be an issue if you've got a lot of amines in your gut. Okay, we're almost there.
Yep.
When the microbiome goes out of whack, it also makes toxic gases, and those would be specifically methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia. Methane causes intestinal paralysis, memory loss, headache, fatigue, eye problems, emotional dysfunction, and premature aging. Same thing, right? We're back to that again. Hydrogen sulfide and its similar chemicals, that's kind of a family, cause sleep apnea, headache, irritability, insomnia, fatigue, and genetic damage. And then the last one is ammonia. And ammonia is really one of the keys to how the microbiome fails. One thing it does is it damages the lysosomes, which is what is actually inside the cell, recycling and detoxifying things. So you don't want to mess up the lysosomes. It causes memory loss, attention deficit, insomnia, Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig, MS. A lot of neurologic symptoms are ammonia, and accelerated aging. Again, right? A lot of aging is coming out of the gut, a lot of aging. But ammonia has one problem worse than all the others. It makes the gut go alkaline. Okay? Good bacteria need an acidic environment. Toxic bacteria prefer neutral or alkaline. Ben, have you ever canned food?
I've purchased canned food. I have not canned it myself.
Okay. If you get into canning food, you learn that you can only can acidic food. If what you're trying to can is not acidic enough, you have to acidify it. Because if it's not acidic enough, you can have botulinum growing in there, right? And then, you get botulism. So a bad canning operation happens when when you're canning something alkaline or not acidic enough, because the bacteria that can grow in there would be a mess. The gut goes the same way. The gut can become a bad canning operation, growing all the wrong bacteria. So what happens is, below a pH of 6.6, if you get ammonia, which would be from eating too much meat, well, let me rephrase that, eating more meat than you can digest and absorb. If you digest and absorb it all in your small intestine, that's fine. But if you eat more than you can digest and absorb, and it gets into the small intestine and it gets into the large intestine, aside from putrefying, one of the things it'll do is you can get ammonia. Now, below a pH of 6.6, here's where the pH is coming in. Below a pH of 6.6, ammonia is in the form of ammonium, and that's mildly acidic and not well absorbed. Over a pH of 6.6, it becomes ammonia, which is very alkaline and very well absorbed. It gets into the liver. Most of the liver enzymes are there to try to actually get rid of ammonia. It gets into the bloodstream. It gets into the brain. And it makes the gut go alkaline. And when the gut goes out neutral or alkaline, that's when all the bad bacteria start to grow. That's the bad canning operation in your gut, right? So the microbiome, it's going to do everything it can to hold the pH at 6.6. That's its line in the sand. Because once it goes above that, it'll just keep on going more and more alkaline, and it's going to make those inflammatory lipids, the toxic short-chain fatty acids, the toxic amines, and the poisonous gases in a bad cycle. So it tries to hold the line at 6.6, right? So here's what you want to do. You want to get rid of the toxic gram-negative bacteria so that you can then recolonize with the good gram-positive bacteria. To do this, we need good short-chain fatty acids to go in there and knock the gram-negative down. But our gut's not making enough of them. So you have to supplement with them for a little while. Now, to do this, I made 2 short-chain fatty acid supplements. One's from the top down and one's from the bottom up. And I'll give you my reasoning for why and how I made these. The bottom one up is called Fermented, and it's a short-chain fatty acid microenema. Now, what happens with the colon is it gets more and more alkaline as it gets closer to the rectum. So the most alkaline part of the colon is at the very bottom, like in the sigmoid. So what the Fermented, that's the product for the.
How do you spell that?
𝙎𝙬𝘎𝑙𝑎𝑚𝑒𝑡, right? So what we do is we squirt some short-chain fatty acids into the sigmoid. And what it does is, when you have short-chain fatty acids, well, they're acidic. So now you're reacidifying the sigmoid. And as it becomes more acidic, an acid sigmoid is less likely to make all those nasty things, and is also, because it's got the short-chain fatty acids, the bad bacteria can absorb those short-chain fatty acids and get knocked down. So injecting short-chain fatty acids rectally is, I think, a great idea. It has to be at a particular pH, at a very particular concentration, a very particular ratio. And what you really are trying to do is you're trying to recreate healthy feces, right? I don't think you necessarily have to do a fecal transplant anymore. But what healthy feces does in your gut is, as it's traveling through your gut, it's continuously, slowly releasing short-chain fatty acids. These are very powerful molecules. You do not want to blast them in all at once. What you want is a timed, slow release. So what we've done with Fermented is it's a slow release of short-chain fatty acids at the right concentration and at the right ratio.
Is this a suppository, or is it a capsule?
No, it's like, so what you do is you get like a rectal syringe, which is like a little small syringe with a little kind of rounded
So you're
tip.
injecting that.
You squirt it up and you lay in your back with your hips raised for like 10 minutes to get it to go up the sigmoid and maybe up the descending colon.
That's why you saw it bottom up. That makes sense.
That's the bottom up, right? Okay. So
And then the top down, what's that
now
one?
the top down, okay, now this takes us into fermented foods. So a lot of people will read fermented foods are great for them, and then they take them and they feel terrible.
Yeah.
So there's two dark sides to fermented foods, right? One is, remember we talked about what probiotics I don't want to take is the ones, the D-lactic acid and the
Mhm.
histamine. Well, it's the same with fermented foods, right? Because
Yeah.
Minerals, minerals, minerals. You hear a lot of people out there speaking about the benefits of taking minerals, and it is important because in this day and age, our crops, our fruits, and our vegetables, they are depleted of minerals. So you've heard of the keto flu, you've heard of symptoms doing keto and fasting. People just don't feel good sometimes. This is the number one reason why. So my go-to for replenishing my electrolytes and my minerals, for enhancing my immune system, for gut support, for detoxification, is bean minerals. It has fulvic and humic compounds, and these have over 70 trace minerals and really important electrolytes to replenish your body with. Check out Bean Minerals over at beanminerals.com. Use the coupon code AZADI, my last name, at checkout to get a nice discount. That is AZADI at checkout over at beanminerals.com.
fermented foods, if the bacteria that is being used for fermented foods will create D-lactic acid and L-lactic acid. You don't want D-lactic acid. We have a very limited way to capability of getting rid of it, and it causes all sorts of neurologic symptoms. Now, if someone has a good gut to begin with, and they get a little D-lactic acid from the Streptococcus thermophilus, of their yogurt, they'll deal with it. They're saying, hey, I take fermented foods all the time. It's not a big deal. But you get somebody who's already making D-lactic acid in their gut and you give them more, and then they're not going to feel right. Yeah. The second thing is a lot of fermented foods, the probiotics being used for those make histamine, right? And again, that's not something we want because a lot of people, their guts are already making lots of amines. And so their amine loads are very high and they can't handle that. So what I did is I said, okay, well, what do we want? What's the good part of fermented foods? It's the L-lactic acid. It's the acetic acid. So what I did is I made a product called Lactamet, which is 100% L-lactic acid, and acetic acid, and a few other cofactors, so that you can have the benefit of the fermented foods without the downsides. And that's the top-down approach, right? And so now we're trying to get, we're working down through the small intestine down and working the large intestine up. And then the idea is to kind of jumpstart your metabolic motors of your microbiome, so that it'll finally catch and take and start, knocking down the gram negative, letting the gram positive grow, and then now you're starting to make your own short chain fatty acids. The pH starts normalizing, and you're good to go.
Brilliant. Oh, I'm getting those two products. I have two questions. Number one, so you said it's not necessarily eating too much meat and protein that's the issue. It's the fact that you're not breaking it down efficiently. It makes me think about those that are doing OMAD 1 meal a day, or even a carnivore diet 1 meal a day. And honestly, sometimes I'll do 1 meal a day and I'll eat a whole bunch of protein in 1 meal. How do I know if I'm not breaking it down efficiently? Are we looking at kidney markers for that? Symptoms?
Sure, sure. Right. So it's two issues. One, if you lack the enzymatic capacity to break it down, and then two, if you lack the small intestine capacity to absorb what you've broken down. Right. So there's either or both of those can cause an overflow of protein into the large intestine. The only thing you want getting in your large intestine are prebiotics, fiber. That's all. Everything else should get absorbed in the small intestine. And when fats and proteins spill over into the large intestine, it feeds bad bacteria in bad ways, right? So you do an OMAD diet and you eat an enormous amount of food. Okay, but do you have an enormous capacity of pancreatic enzymes and stomach acid and absorptive capacity to absorb all of that at once? I don't think so, or at least not for most people. So I
But
personally
how do we
would.
know?
So what you do, I'm sorry, you asked that. So what you would do is you would go and get a stool test, and they would look at undigested materials in your stool, and they would say, hey, I am seeing, undigested things in here. Or the other thing you could do would be, you would start to see the occurrence of nasty metabolites from the bacterial fermentation of fats and proteins. But then now you're looking at a $500 test. But if you're that kind of biohacker, go check it out.
And then the other question, oh, before I get to that second question, what about taking apple cider vinegar before a meal to help with the acidity? Is that a good idea?
Well, again, you're probably going to get histamine and you're
Mm,
probably going to get D-lactic acid.
mm,
So what I do is I take the lactamat, I take 20 drops and 2 ounces of carrot juice, the stuff that I've already fermented,
yes.
and I drink it down, and my body just loves that stuff. Um, I can't tell you what it's done for people because that's just how the rules of our world work right now. But
Yeah.
um, I I had I had a very close family member that was close to dying, and they're not now, and it was very quick.
Wow.
How quickly they improved, how quickly proper short chain fatty acids turned them from someone who called me up and said that they were at death's door and basically saying goodbye to me, and 3 days later going out and cracking jokes, and I'm like, wow, that was fast.
That's
And
amazing.
yeah, and so that's what, short chain fatty acids are very powerful.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Um,
I did have a follow-up question though. I probably asked you this before. What about people who drink high pH water, alkaline water every day?
it's not high pH water. That's okay. So think of it this way, right? pH, think of it as like speed of something, right? Now, if you get hit by a truck, not you, sorry. If a truck or a train going at 60 miles an hour is a lot different than a feather going at 60 miles an hour. They're both 60 miles an hour, right? So if you make that alkaline water, yes, it shows it's very alkaline, but it has no tetrametric or buffering capability. You put a drop of lemon juice in it, and it's acidic again. So it's a phantom reading,
So like
right?
the feather going 60 miles an hour is the analogy here. It's not
Yeah,
really going
it's
to
not
do
really
much.
alkaline. It's not
Meaning
going
it's
to do
not
anything.
okay. When it enters the
Nor
gut,
would you want it to. You don't, right? I mean,
that's the point I'm trying to make because I see the craze with alkaline water and it makes me think like, why would you want to do that?
okay, so what the alkaline water may be doing is changing redox, but that's a whole other conversation. But if you look at the body, in terms of pH, right? Skin has a pH of between 4 and 6.5. Your stomach is 1 to 3. The vaginal fluid is 4.7. Your intracellular, hang on a second. Your intercellular fluid is 6 to 7.2, and then that's all acid. And then there are some places that are alkaline, like cerebrospinal fluid and your blood. That's like 7.3, 7.4, but that's just barely alkaline. Really, the only place that's really alkaline in the body is the bile and pancreatic fluids. Everything else is pretty much acidic. So, this traces back to old naturopathic ideas when they thought acids were a bad thing, and it's an oversimplified concept. You want the right pH from the right agents at the right location.
Got it. Okay. Um, are we ready to transition to the
Well,
latest research? Okay, go ahead.
okay, sorry about that. Okay, so there's a couple of other ways you can tell about your stool besides a $500 test, right?
Okay.
Another is your transit time. So you want your transit time, that is the time it takes from when you eat to go to the bathroom, to be 24 hours. And people will say, hey, I go to the bathroom every day. Sure, but if what came out of you was what went in 5 days ago, then even though you're going every day, it's a 5-day transit time. That's a mess. So what you do is you take a tablespoon of chlorophyll, liquid chlorophyll, and then wait until your stool turns green, not just a little green, like the big dump of green in the toilet water. That's how many hours? That's your transit time. You want that 24 hours, okay? Toilet paper is another one, right? And then of course the stool pH. And what I would tell people is, 6 to 6.4 is great. 6.5 to 6.6, you're right at the edge. You're barely hanging on. 7.0, it's trouble. 7.5, there's a lot of trouble. And at a pH of 8 or more, just stop everything you're doing and fix it. This is your priority over everything, is fixing that. And which takes us to the next conversation, which would be cancer. So
yeah, cancer. 1 in 3 in America, 1 in 3 women in America will get cancer. Men 1 in 2, according to the CDC. Number 2 killer right after heart disease. So when we talk about longevity and lifespan and health span, like preventing cancer, avoiding it,
Yeah.
is the key here. So you're going to share something with me that's you're super excited about. You're a great researcher. I love your research. I have not heard about this yet. You wanted to reveal it right here on this episode. So what you got, Spencer?
Okay. All right. So in spite of billions of dollars invested, okay, let me preempt this first. Neither I nor Ben are physicians, and nothing you're about to hear should be constituted as medical advice for the diagnosis or treatment of any disease or condition. Okay.
I concur.
Great. Having said that, in spite of billions of dollars invested over decades, with up to now, I think close to 4 million research papers published, cancer, as you say, is the #2 cause of death. And why is this? I think that there are 2 reasons that this is the case. The first is we thought it was genetic, and it's not. What genes will do is will tell you if you're going to, they can make you more likely to have cancer, and they'll tell you if you have cancer, what kind you're likely to get and where it's likely to appear. But it's not genetic, and I'll refer to a study that will prove that in a second. And the second thing is someone gave the wrong name to a key receptor about 50 years ago, and that sent the entire cancer industry looking in the wrong direction. That's just my opinion, right? So let's take a look at these. I think it's these 2 errors that have pushed cancer research in the wrong direction and why we don't have a cure yet.
So focusing on it being a genetic problem, #1, and then a misnamed receptor, #2, are the 2 main reasons why we have this war against cancer.
Those are some heavy claims to make, and let's see. I'll share with you where my research went, and then you can decide whether you think what I tell, what I'm expressing is valid.
Let's do it.
Okay. Until recently, cancer was considered genetic. And yes, we have identified some 50,000 different genetic mutations found in cancer cells. But is the cancer caused by the mutations, or are the mutations caused by the cancer? It's an important question. You have to know cause and effect, right? All right. So there was a groundbreaking study in 2022 published in the International Journal of Molecular Science that we'll put a link up to. And we now know that definitively cancer is not caused by genetics. So in this study is they took the DNA from a cancerous cell and they put it into a non-cancerous cell. So the blue ones here on the left are the cancers, and the red ones on the right are not cancer. They call them mutants because they had to do some kind of manipulations in order to do this experiment, right? So what they did is they took the blue cancerous DNA from the cancer cell and put it in a non-cancer cell, and the cell did not become cancerous. The genetics did not turn it into a cancer cell. Then they did the opposite. They took the good genetics, that would be the little red circle, and put it in the blue cell, that would be the cancer cell. And it did it stayed cancerous, right? So it didn't reverse it. So what we know for a fact is now cancer does not cause, genetics does not cause cancer. That study proves that. That's smoking gun evidence. Okay. So what we now think is that, or we're told, is that 80% of cancers are being caused by something in the environment. Okay, so then the question is, what's in the environment that's causing cancer? I think there are 2 fundamental causes of cancer, and I think they both relate to short-chain fatty acids. That's the same short-chain fatty acids that a good microbiome makes. Short-chain fatty acids, we could do a whole hour on that alone. They're absolutely vital for the proper functioning of our bodies. They regulate our brain, our digestion, our endocrine system, our immune system, our neurotransmitters, on, right? And this is what I think happens. When our microbiome doesn't make enough short-chain fatty acids, our bodies create special organs to make short-chain fatty acids for us. And we call these special organs cancer.
Huh.
Yeah. It's quite a claim to make, right?
So the tumor or the tumor is making these short-chain fatty acids?
It's quite a claim to make. So let me give you what evidence I think validates this theory. But yes, I think tumors are making short-chain fatty acids. I think that's primarily what they are there to do.
Holy crap.
Yeah. Okay, so if the body were going to make a new organ, what tissue would it make it from? Well, most likely the pluripotent stem cells, because they can become anything. And what do we think many cancers begin as? Pluripotent stem cells. All right. What else would we expect to see if this theory were correct? Well, we'd expect to see that these tumors are actually making short-chain fatty acids. Are they? Okay, so remember, there's 4 good short-chain fatty acids: lactic acid, acetic acid, propionic acid, and butyric acid. Let's look at them one at a time. First, lactic acid. One of the first scientists to suggest cancer was a metabolic disorder was Otto Warburg. And he posed that in cancer, the Krebs cycle goes backwards. And this would be a great time to put up an image of the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is the main energy producing cycle in a healthy cell. And with every rotation of the cycle, it makes 32 ATP molecules, adenosine triphosphate, which, for those that don't remember, high school bio, that's the energy currency of the body. It's ATP that runs everything. So Krebs cycle running properly makes 32 ATP per cycle. And what Dr. Warburg discovered was that in people with cancer, the Krebs cycle was going backwards. Now, a backwards Krebs cycle still makes energy, but it only makes 2 ATP molecules, not 32. That's a 94% loss of efficiency. Surely this must be a mistake. There must be something wrong with the cell that it's being so inefficient, right? No sane cell would do this on purpose, right? Okay, a backwards Krebs cycle in a cancerous cell is inefficient, I agree. Inefficient at making ATP, but it's wonderfully efficient at making lactic acid. So cancer cells, we know they make lactic acid. Now, what does the current model say about lactic acid in a cancer cell? They say lactic acid in a cancer cell is bad. It causes the hallmarks of cancer: angiogenesis, that's new blood vessel growth; metastasis, which is cells breaking off and going and creating new tumors; immune dysfunction, including problems with apoptosis, which is how cancer cells should commit suicide; lower T and natural killer cell activities. They're saying that the lactic acid is what's causing this. Is it? Well, it turns out in 2016 in the scientific journal Oncotarget, published by some researchers, thank you very much, who did this. What they did is they had lactic acid in a cancer cell at a high level, 20 mm. But they buffered the cell, so they kept it at 6.7 pH, which is only mildly acidic, which is where cells are fine with. What happens? The cancer cell started acting like a normal cell again. Well, what does this tell us? Lactic acid doesn't contribute to cancer. It's the low pH that the lactic acid created, or should I say the inability of the cell to buffer the low pH of the lactic acid. It turns out if you can keep the cell from going acidic, then lactic acid, I think, is actually beneficial for people with cancer. Okay, so there is the lactic acid. What happens is the issue with lactic acid, we now know, we know that the tumor cells are making lactic acid, and that it's not the lactic acid per se that's the problem, it's the pH from the lactic acid. Okay, that's 1 down, that's lactic acid down. 3 more to go. How about acetic acid? Do cancer cells make acetic acid? Okay, I haven't seen any studies that measure the amount of acetic acid in a cancer cell. But what I do know is that there are 2 enzymes needed to make acetic acid: ATP citrate lyase and histone decarboxylase. And both of them are elevated. They're abnormally high in cancer cells. That to me says acetic acid is being produced. Well, what does current research say about acetic acid? Well, they're a little confused. They say endogenous acetic acid, that's inside the cell, causes cancer proliferation, but outside the cell reduces cancer cell proliferation. And they're very confused by this. They don't understand how acetic acid has this good and this bad effect. Well, let's take a look at it through the lens of short-chain fatty acids and cancer and pH. Acetic acid on the outside of the cell is saying, hey, emergency averted. We have short-chain fatty acids again. You guys can stop making them inside the cell because we now have them from our gut, right? That's the cancer cell calming down. That's why exogenous, external acetic acid calms cancer down. But if you put it inside, well, what does it do? Well, it lowers the pH. And remember, acidic pH is part of what's driving the cancer cell's behavior. That's okay. Let's talk a little bit more about pH, right? Short-chain fatty acids are made in the gut, and the gut lining, in order not to get completely destroyed by the pH, it sloughs off every couple of days. That way, the acidic environment of the short-chain fatty acids doesn't create colon cancer, right? It just says, okay, you've been here for 3 days, out, and we'll put a new cell in there, right? It refreshes just like skin does all the time. Okay, well, what about in cancer cells that are making what I think are short-chain fatty acids? They try to get rid of the cells too, but they can't. They have no way to slough off. But there is a way to get rid of cells. It's called metastasis.
Hmm.
So metastasis, I think, is partially from the cells escaping this highly acidic environment. Now, over time, the acidity from the short chain fatty acids that I believe are being produced in cancer cells creates structural and metabolic changes, and metastasis is one of them. Cancer cells, the environment of a cancer cell can be up to 56 times more acidic than a normal cell. If
Wow.
I had to live in a vat of acid, I'd misbehave too. I'd be
Yeah.
irritable. You'd see me doing all sorts of crazy things, right?
Yeah.
Those poor little cells burning up like that. I mean, they're just trying to help out. They're like, okay, if I'm not getting short chain fatty acids, I'll make some, but don't make me do it for very long because this stuff hurts. You know, it's burning. Okay. So then what do the cells then do? Because now they're getting acidic, but they still have to keep making short chain fatty acids. Well, to buffer the acidity, they bring in alkaline sodium and calcium. What do you find in cancer? Elevated sodium and calcium. And we also know that sodium and calcium makes cancer cells behave in a more cancerous, a more aggressive manner. All right. So here's another one for you. Maybe it's when the gut goes alkaline that we're getting colon cancer, because I'm thinking what's going on is the low pH of the gut is what's triggering the cells in the gut to release and go away. But when it's alkaline because the gut is out of whack, those cells are not triggered to do that, but the gut is still in the presence of toxic short chain fatty acids and amines and poisonous gases, and it becomes cancerous that way. But I digress. So that's lactic acid and acetic acid. That's 2 short chain fatty acids down and 2 to go. Let me pause for a second and ask you if there's anything I need to clarify about what I've said so far.
No, I this is a lot of info. Like, this is a lot. I personally did rewatch this and I'm taking notes. No, continue. What are the other 2? So 2 down,
Okay,
2
2
to
down,
go.
2 to go. Okay,
Yeah.
we have propionic acid and butyric acid. Now, there is a pathway to make propionic acid in cells. Now, mind you, again, I looked to see if anyone measured propionic acid and butyric acid in cells, and I couldn't find it. So I have to look for kind of evidence that there are pathways that are being upregulated for them, right? Like it is for acetate or acetic acid. So there is a pathway to make propionic acid in cells. It's the breakdown of certain amino acids. One of them is methionine. Now, if a cancer cell were making propionic acid, what would we expect to see would happen to methionine levels? We'd expect to see it go down as it's consumed to make propionic acid. Now, what kills people in cancer at the end is cachexia, right? They starve to death, protein wasting. What's the very first amino acid to decrease in cancer cachexia? It's methionine. Why is that going down? Maybe to make propionic acid. All right, one last one. Butyric acid, the last good short chain fatty acid. In normal cells, there's a process, another way to make energy outside Krebs called beta oxidation. And this is where fatty acids are broken down to make energy. Now, scientists tell us that cancer cells have altered and weird beta oxidation. They don't quite understand what's going on with the beta oxidation pathway. And what they say is, and what they say is that the altered beta oxidation isn't completely burning fatty acids, that instead small bits of fatty acid are left over. Now listen to that term, small bits of fatty acid are being created. Change the word small bits for short chains. Small bits, short chains, same thing. So instead of small bits of fatty acid are left over or being formed, short chains of fatty acids are being formed. It's forming short chain fatty acids. So now we know, so what I believe is going on is that just like the Krebs cycle can go backwards to make lactate, the beta oxidation pathway can go backwards to make short chain fatty acids, including butyrate. And I don't think it's far-fetched because beta oxidation can go backwards in bacteria all the time. It's called RBOX, or reversed beta oxidation. And, you know, where does the genetic heritage from all of us? Well, we're coming from the same biochemistry as bacteria. The same information is in there that we can do these things. We just don't want to. It's not good for us unless you have to generate some short chain fatty acids. Well, then you've got reverse beta oxidation might do it for you. So that's all 4 short chain fatty acids, the lactic, the acetic, the propionic, and butyric. Are there any other aspects about cancer, any mysteries about cancer that might be explained by this theory, right? One of the ways that you know you've got a good theory is that not only does it explain what you know better than the previous theories, but it takes mysteries that you couldn't figure out with previous theories and explains those, right? So Why is ketosis helpful in cancer? Well, what are the two main ketone bodies that are being made in ketosis?
Beta hydroxybutyrate, an acetone, acetoacetate. Yeah.
Acetoacetate. Okay, acetoacetate. Well, that's and 3-beta hydroxybutyrate. You can start to hear in
Short chain
those
fatty
words, right?
acids.
Right. So what happens is there are enzymes that can convert acetoacetate into acetic acid and hydroxybutyrate into butyric acid. I think that the reason why, or one of the reasons why a ketosis diet is helping with cancer is it's making short chain fatty acids.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were explaining that, that's exactly where my mind went to, and you just said it.
Yeah.
Oh, that is so fascinating.
All right. I mean, that's the thing about this particular model is a lot of stuff starts to make sense that didn't make sense before. Okay, well, what about the 80% of all cancers being caused from environmental toxins? How does that fit into this theory? Okay, so we're told that 80% of cancers are caused from the environment, and that would be viruses. Most of us have at least one cancer virus in us. Mold toxins, the technical name is aflatoxin, but we'll just call them, mold toxins. And carcinogenic chemicals like dioxins and, the weird stuff you find in plastics. How does this fit in? All right, here we go. There is a receptor called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. I'm just going to call it the hydrocarbon receptor. It was discovered in 1976 as a receptor that dioxin, the chemical that causes cancer that was in Agent Orange, binds to. And it's a terrible name.
Yeah.
It's a terrible name because it's not a hydrocarbon receptor. The first oil well that was ever drilled was in the 1800s. We didn't have hydrocarbons in our environment back then, right? That should have been a working title until they figured out what it really was. And what it really is, I think, is a short-chain fatty acid receptor that will also bind to hydrocarbons, that will also bind to viruses, some viruses, that will also bind to aflatoxins, mold toxins. So it binds to a lot of things. In a perfect world, it binds just to short-chain fatty acids, but it binds to the three main things that cause cancer, which is certain viruses, certain mold toxins, and carcinogens. Now, depending on what it binds to, you get very different effects in the cell. It's not like just a switch off and on. So remember those dials I was telling you about? Okay, so, a dial is a multi-position switch, right? It can go in a lot of places. So when we have these receptors, they're calling them hydrocarbon receptors, and if it binds to short-chain fatty acids, because your body's making enough of them, well, then the short-chain fatty acids settle the dials to the right settings, and you've got health and balance. If that receptor binds to certain viruses, like coronavirus, and this may explain why why we're getting turbo cancers. That is someone who, from diagnosis to death, is 30 days. They get diagnosed with cancer on day 1, they're dead on day 30. Turbo cancers.
Yeah, you talked about that during our last episode. Yeah.
Right. So this receptor binds to viruses, very specifically the coronavirus. Okay. It binds to mold toxins and the certain chemicals. And when it does bind to those and not the short chain fatty acids, the dials get put into different settings in different locations. And it turns on a different set of genes. Instead of the genes that promote health, it turns on genes that promote cancer. So what do I think causes cancer? I think it's a combination of several events. We have insufficient short-chain fatty acids from a microbiome, right? And that triggers the body to say, I need more short-chain fatty acids. Let me make some cells whose job it is just to make short-chain fatty acids. We call that a tumor. Then the acids of the short-chain fatty acids over time damages the environment of those cells, triggers metabolic and structural changes that we call cancer. And in the absence of short-chain fatty acids from the gut, and in the presence of these toxins, they will then bind to the receptor and activate more cancer-causing genes. Now, it's not that the genes themselves are causing the cancer. They're being activated by the viruses and the mold toxins and the chemicals to do it. But if you had enough short-chain fatty acids in your body, you'd be less likely to absorb those toxins on the hydrocarbon receptors, right? So like, think about what they do if there's a nuclear event. They say, well, take iodine, right? Because if you're iodine deficient, then you're more likely to absorb radioactive iodine from a nuclear accident. But if you take lots of iodine, all the iodine receptors in your thyroid are full, and then your body doesn't absorb as much the iodine from the outside because there's no need for it. And I think the same thing is for the short-chain fatty acids. It's not that you won't absorb some of these viruses and fungal toxins and cancer-causing agents, but if they can't get onto the receptor and get pulled into the cell where they're going to wreak all sorts of damage And on the DNA, it's not so much of an issue. So one of the things that happens is they found that there were multiple kinds of dioxins, and some dioxins were really, really carcinogenic, and some not so much. The difference, it turns out, was how strongly they bonded to the short chain fatty, to the receptor, right? Now, the ones that didn't bind hardly at all didn't cause much cancer, or they seem to be pretty non-toxic. However, the ones that bond really, really strongly, like 300 times more strongly than the other ones, they cause the cancer. So it's the binding to that receptor. And because we called it a hydrocarbon receptor, as opposed to a short chain fatty acid receptor, we weren't thinking about that in terms of cancer. We were thinking the cancer is the hydrocarbons. Well, yeah, it's part of it. But if you've got the short chain fatty acids, you have much more resistance because your receptors are already filled up, right? So then now the question is, what do we do with all this information?
Yeah, that was my question. Let me share, because I'm listening and learning myself. So let me share what I think are some actionable steps. You give me feedback and then you add to it. How does that sound?
Hit it. Let's go.
All right, so I'm just looking at my notes here. So the name of the game is the gut microbiome. It starts with what you just, how the conversation started. So check the pH of your gut, get those pH papers, and let's make sure that it is less, 6.5 or less or so is like where we want to hit. If you're at 7.2 or higher, it's a problem. So check the pH, number one. You could pay attention to how healthy your gut is by the number of times you swipe in terms of like toilet paper. 0 is what you want, is ideal. And the more you swipe, the more unhealthy your gut is. A stool test is a way to look at your gut. You have to pay money for that. You could also do something for transit time, take a chlorophyll liquid powder, even like a blueberry powder, and see when that comes out. It should be 24 hours later. Keto could be great because the beta hydroxybutyrate, the acetoacetate could convert into short chain fatty acids. Your 2 products is a must for everybody watching, which is Lactomet, top down, Filament, bottom up. Get both. If you're doing OMAD and eating a lot of protein in one sitting, it's probably a good idea to spread it out. And I think those are my biggest takeaways. So feedback on that.
Sure.
And what else would you add?
Okay, so there's 3 things I would add to that. If you're going to do an OMAD, make sure that every meal, if I would not have a meal without some amount of prebiotics in there, especially if I'm doing OMAD where I'm loading myself up with more protein than I know that I can absorb. Because remember, the bad bacteria will ferment protein unless there's enough prebiotics there, because that's their preferred fuel, right? They would rather eat that. Another thing is you can spend $500 on a stool test, and a lot of them won't even tell you your stool pH, which I think is the most important part of it. And the third is I would not want my stool pH 6.6 or higher. I think, the higher it goes, the worse, but I would be unhappy personally with anything above a 6.3.
So you're aiming for 6. We should all aim for 6.3 or below,
or less, right? Yeah. Remember that the pH of the stool of breastfed, naturally born children pre-antibiotic age was 4.8, 4.9.
Wow, that's super acidic. Wow.
And you find 5.7 out in Africa. And what's making it that acidic? It's the short chain fatty acids. That's what's different, right? Okay. So what do you do with all this information, right? So the basics are, yes, raise the short chain fatty acids. The goal would be to get your body to make them for you. But until that happens, take them supplementally. And the next thing, I want to see is I want to see the pH of the cancer go up. It turns out that it's not the cancer cell that gets so acidic, it drops like 0.1. It's actually the environment that it's in that gets really acidic. So it's pushing the acids out, but the environment it's sitting in, the tub that it's soaking in, is very acidic, right? And we want to raise that up. So I would do some high pH protocols. I know that there's high pH protocols that some people use with cancer, and they try to bring the cancer cell up to like a pH of 8, and then they cause all sorts of other problems. I don't agree with that.
Hey, I want to just briefly interrupt the video you're watching to share something with you. One of my favorite companies that I use for health and longevity and biohacking is a company called BondCharge. And they have a whole range of incredible products, including the blue light blocking glasses you see me wear right now. But one of my favorite products from them is an infrared sauna blanket. Sauna blanket works by raising your heart rate to a workout or a training session. So you burn more calories while you're actually lying down and relaxing. Also, it's going to cause you to sweat. And one method of flushing out toxins from your body is through sweat. There's also one of my favorite benefits, this endorphin release. Every time I get out of the sauna blanket, I feel like I just got a 60-minute massage. So it's easy to set up. It's super convenient. Head over to bondcharge.com/KetoCamp. And if you use the coupon code KetoCamp at checkout, you'll get 15% off your sauna blanket. And actually, any of their products are 15% off with that code. All right, let's get back to today's video.
I don't think that the issue with cancer is fundamentally that the pH is low. I think that's a second order effect from the issue with the short chain fatty acids. So what I want to see is the pH of that cancer cell, the extracellular fluid, the stroma, go up to, the high sixes, but no farther. So I want to raise the pH up for that, right? But not so aggressively that we're causing other issues, just long enough so that once the short chain fatty acids are there and the cell is getting the message, hey, you don't need to make them anymore, the pH drops on its own. Okay, so then we've got these receptors. And how do we clean the receptors off, right? Because remember, these things are real, the viruses, the mold toxins, and specifically dioxins, they're really, really sticky. They got on a receptor and they do not want to let go for, like a 5-day half-life for dioxin. That
Wow.
means it takes 30 days to get down to 1.5%. And what I think happens is you've got these nasty carcinogens attaching to the receptor. They get inside the cell. They cause all sorts of genetic triggers that are not the ones we want. They stay on. They damage the DNA. There's an aspect of phase 1 and phase 2 detox where if they don't have enough glutathione, they actually can cause genetic damage, which is why you want to have your glutathione levels up if you're dealing with this. But here's what I'm concerned about. They're on the receptors, and then they fall off over the course of 5 to 10, 20 days, and then they get right back on again, right? So what I want to do is I want to do two things with the receptors. I want to knock those toxins off the receptors, and then I want to seal the receptors up so that the toxins can't get back on. And then I want to detoxify the chemicals. Now, if you just try to detoxify the chemicals and they're stuck on the receptor, you can't access them. You have to wait for them to get off the receptor, then detoxify them. And that might be a very narrow window in time to do that. So my thought is, I want to detoxify them, right? You know that we have, some products for detoxification, but I want to open the window up where they are available to be detoxified. So there's a protocol we're working on where we try to knock the toxins off the receptor and then seal the receptor up with a good version of a short chain fatty acid, something actually like a short chain fatty acid, meaning it's good for you, but stronger binding, so it stays on there for a little bit. So we're going to try to seal them up for like a month while we're pulling all the chemicals out, and then the short chain fatty acids can take over the job. So then also detoxify the chemicals, and then the other part is we want to deal with any of the viruses that might be causing cancer. Because, I don't know if somebody presents with cancer, I'm pretty confident it's a short chain fatty acid problem, but is it mold toxins or chemicals or viruses? I don't know. So there's a protocol where we use radio waves to blast certain viruses.
So Spencer, what about the traditional ways that they treat cancer, different surgeries and chemotherapy, et cetera, et cetera? What about those options?
So let's talk about chemotherapy first. Cancer cells have upregulated P-glycoprotein levels. Now, P-glycoproteins are pumps that push toxins out of a cell very effectively. And in cancer cells, they have lots of them. So this means that they can detoxify themselves faster than normal cells. And so this also means they're nearly impervious to being poisoned. That's why chemotherapy has so many side effects, because try as you might to design a chemical that will only affect cancer cells, the cancer cells just keep pumping these chemicals out, and then the rest of the body has to deal with that, with those chemicals. How about radiation? Sure, but cancer cells have upregulated heat shock proteins, which makes them very resistant to radiation. Also, radiation damages something called cytoplasmic factor, which is one of the protective methods that keeps cancer cells from becoming very aggressive. Okay, how about surgery? Well, there is this weird thing that happens with surgery, which is when you remove a tumor, all the satellite tumors become more aggressive. Why is this? Well, think about it. If your primary tumor is making 80% of your short chain fatty acids and suddenly it goes offline, all those secondary tumors are going to have to have to step in there and make more. They did a study where they had two tumors on opposite sides of a rat, and they inject one side with blue dye and one side with red dye. And a few days later, the red dye went to the blue side and the blue dye went to the red side. Tumors communicate to
Wow.
each other. It's like a superorganism. So if the main tumor body is removed, then you run the risk of having all the secondary tumors take the slack up. I'm not saying don't do surgery, but I would never but think about what happens if you do surgery without simultaneously raising short chain fatty acids. Think what message you're sending to the metastases. All right, now let's take a look at, so that was chemotherapy and radiation and surgery. Right. Now, I want to add one last thing to this, and that is recognize that cancer cells are adaptations. They have adapted to incredibly difficult environments. They've adapted to make short chain fatty acids. They've adapted to low levels of energy. They've adapted to acidity. They've adapted to all these alkaline metals coming in. They've adapted to they are adaptation machines. And the idea that we're going to send something at it that it can't adapt to, I think it's the wrong idea. They are fantastic at adapting, right? I think what you do is you don't give it one more thing that's difficult for the body to deal with that it can just adapt to. I think what you do is you give it what it's missing, which is the short chain fatty acid.
For my audience, they're like, how could I learn more? RemedyLink.com is Spencer's website. You could get the supplements that we mentioned, plus the ones we didn't mention. I use all your products. RemedyLink.com. Is there anywhere else? There's a contact form on your website, but is there anywhere else you want them to go? Or is that the main site?
Yeah, we'll be posting up a video on our video page that will discuss what you and I just discussed, but for the people who are watching this that are more scientifically minded, I'll actually get into, a lot of the enzymes and a lot of the biochemical pathways in more detail. And, it's my hope that, because I'm not, I'm just one guy, right? I'm praying that this catches the attention of some clinics and some researchers, and they're able to determine whether or not acetic acid actually is at higher levels in a cancer cell, butyric acid and propionic actually are at higher levels, and whether or not this protocol or something that they come up with based on this model actually has some good effects. So that's my prayer, that some researchers out there follow up with this, and let's see where it leads.
If you enjoyed that conversation, check out the recent interview I did with Dr. Berg, all about eating the right foods on keto and carnivore, how to burn fat and feel good.
Sometimes people think that ketones are a secondary source of fuel and the primary is glucose, but if that was the case, where was this glucose available long ago when our bodies were developing? It's so